Welcome back. For this unit, we're again stepping away from the textbook briefly, the Harmer textbook, to cover an important area of second language acquisition that our textbook doesn't cover very deeply. And this is the question of how a student's first language can sometimes interfere with their learning of the second language, in our case, English. You should have read the two articles before coming to this lecture. So the article by Bela and the AC's chapter on second language acquisition that were made available on D2L. So if you haven't read those, please just pause the video, take the time to read, and then come on back. All of the chapter on second language acquisition is important information, and it's going to inform our thinking about teaching practices and lesson planning. But since it should be content that's covered in TESL 341, we're going to focus for this unit mainly on the last section, which is about influences from L1s. Most errors that English language learners make are due to normal language development and are the same regardless of whatever their first language is. So a Russian speaker and a Japanese speaker will make many of the same mistakes. However, there are some errors that can be traced to the influence of the first language. So when an individual's understanding of one language has an impact on their understanding of another language, that individual is experiencing language transfer, which is also sometimes known as L1 interference, linguistic interference, cross-meaning. Sometimes there's a variety of phrases that we use. But basically, it just refers to speakers or writers applying knowledge from their L1 to an L2. There can be negative transfer or negative interference when the understanding of one language complicates the understanding of another language, meaning it makes it harder for them to understand or use another language. Alternatively, there can be positive transfers, such that knowing one language can actually aid in developing the skills for a second language, can actually help learning a second language. We're mostly going to be looking at interference, or the errors that ELLs make that derive from their first languages. So we're going to look at these three areas: phonology, syntax, and morphology. So those should be familiar terms to you from other TESL classes. There are a number of ways that the sound system of the first language can impact learning the sound system of English. So phonology refers to our sounds that we make in English or in any language. Some phonemes or individual sounds that we have in English don't exist in other languages. Can you think of any of these sounds, individual sounds that we make in English that don't exist in some other languages you might know? One common one that we see a lot is L and R. In some languages like Japanese, Korean, Kirundi, they don't exactly have the L or the R sound, but they have something kind of in between, a sound that isn't quite either of those, but is similar to both. And so that's where we get kind of that stereotypical error of something like Fliedlice, where it becomes very difficult for speakers of some of those languages to make a hard R or a clear L sound. Similarly, there's no hard R in Spanish or Tagalog, but again, a sound that is something more like the flap sound in the middle of the words ladder or butter or little. So you'll often hear that flap sound substituted for the R sound in some English words. Similarly, in some languages, there's no sound for like the TH, the th or th that we have in English. So you might hear mistakes like I'm going through the door, or they are my friends, or I think you are right. Just trying to substitute a familiar sound for ones that don't exist in the first language. In other languages, there's no word initial S, so you wouldn't have words begin with the sound S and followed by a consonant. So that's why we might hear I speak Spanish at a school. Um, for many of these sounds, it's important that students just learn to hear them before they're able to actually produce them in these ways that we do in English. Some other examples would be word final consonant clusters. So some clusters of consonants at the end of a word that just wouldn't happen or don't exist in some languages like Caribbean Spanish or Arabic. So that's where you might hear things like instant for instant or breakfast for breakfast. Other times, word initial vowels are rare in other languages. So a vowel at the beginning of a word just wouldn't really happen in some first languages such as Arabic. So it's hard to put a vowel at the beginning of a word. Speaking of vowels, we have a lot of vowel sounds in English. We grow up hearing O, A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. Well, those are letters, but in terms of the sounds that our vowels make in different constructions, we actually have about 14 vowel sounds in English. And the average language has about 8 vowel sounds. So in order to be able to produce all of these vowels, students really need to be taught to hear them before they can be taught to say them. And they matter because the difference between sheep and ship, seat and sit, caught and cat changes the meaning of the word, and they can often use them interchangeably, which becomes quite confusing. Other languages' phonology is much more phonetic than English. So for example, Spanish and Arabic, typically one letter equals one sound, whereas in English, the same letter can represent many different sounds depending on the context, depending on the spelling. And so what you'll find is that that beginners speaking English from some of those first languages will often pronounce every letter in the same way that they would in their first language. So you hear things like finished. Also, things like stress in English, the way that we put different stress on different parts of a word or a phrase changes the meaning of words, and this isn't necessarily the same in other first languages. Many languages have equal stress on each syllable. For us, the stress, like I said, can change the meaning. So you either would have a black bird or a blackbird. It means something different if we put the stress on a different syllable. Similarly, the greenhouse or the greenhouse. It means something different, and that's not obvious depending on your first language. This has to be taught. There are also L1 syntax errors that are due to the unique structure and organization of English. So the order that we put our words in English can be quite different from other first languages. So some languages, such as Spanish, may allow for freer word order for different emphasis in a sentence. So you might hear someone say who's an L1 Spanish speaker, something like, yesterday played very well, the children. Because that would be perfectly normal to put emphasis on yesterday and how the children played very well. But again, in English, we wouldn't allow for that kind of free moving around of the word order. We would have to say something like, the children played very well yesterday, or even yesterday the children played very well, but that subject verb wouldn't be mixed up. In Arabic, the word order is verb subject, so the opposite of how we do it in English, and that's especially true in Arabic writing. The auxiliary verb do that we use in questions or negative statements just doesn't exist in a lot of first languages. So when we say something like, what does Juan eat for lunch? We might hear someone make the error, what eats Juan for lunch? Or he doesn't have a book. You might hear, he not have book. So again, that word do is a very particular construction in English that doesn't necessarily exist in other first languages. Things like articles They may not exist at all in your students' L1s, or they may have different ones or simpler ones. So we have the articles a, an, and the. And sometimes it can be tricky to figure out which one to use. So you might have students who say, this is book, instead of this is a book, or this is the book. I want one cookie instead of I want a cookie. There's some confusion around which article to choose based on a first language interference. Some more issues of L1 interference related to syntax can sometimes include prepositions. We have so many prepositions in English, and many other languages would really just use one. So what exactly is the difference between in the store and at the store? That can be very hard for second language learners to wrap their heads around. Similarly, the pronouns that we have in English aren't necessarily the same in many other languages. Some languages don't assign gender to a pronoun. So you might have something like, my daughter is little, his name is Jennifer. Because in that person's first language, the pronoun there would be the same whether it's a boy or girl, and so they become confused about which one to use. Sometimes the pronoun is left out because it's assumed in the context of the verb. So is blue, which would be similar in Spanish to es azul, it's implied in the verb es, but in English we need the word it. It is blue. Also, the order in which we put adjectives and nouns is not typical or not the same in all languages. So for example, in Spanish, you would put the adjective before the noun typically. And in English, we do it the other way around. So you might get people talking about milk cold or house blue instead of cold milk or a blue house. I'm curious if you can think of any other instances of L1 interference related to syntax. Finally, we see L1 interference errors that have to do with morphology, or the way that words change their shape to change the meaning of that word. That's things like putting a plural S on the end of a plural noun, or putting an ED on a verb ending to indicate past tense. Those things are examples of morphology. And indeed, that plural S ending can be very confusing for a lot of English language learners. Often there is no plural morpheme in Asian languages. They indicate plurality by using other words in the sentence. So you might hear someone talking about many book or many child. That many to them indicates that we're talking about a plural. It can be tricky to realize we need books and children. That same issue can be even more complicated when it comes to non-count nouns. So nouns that don't take a plural ending, like butter or rice or water. Sometimes we get an overgeneralization of that S ending on non-count nouns. We might hear things like butters or rices. Also, verb tenses can be tricky for a lot of English language learners. In most Asian languages, they don't conjugate verbs. They use other context in the sentence to indicate what tense we're talking about. So you might hear, yesterday we go to the store, because the yesterday to them would indicate that's when it happened in the past. They wouldn't necessarily change the verb to went. In Spanish, the present tense is used for a period that starts in the past and continues to the present, which is different than how we use present tense in English. So you might hear someone saying, how long are you working on your present job? In Spanish, this would not be an error, but the tenses don't line up exactly in English in the same way. Additionally, many first languages include double negatives. Those are standard in many first languages. So you'll often hear, Tom not helps her never, or Tom doesn't help her never. That would be a correct translation directly from a lot of first languages, but in standard American English, we typically don't use double negatives. Also, many English phrases that are be plus an adjective are expressed in Spanish as have plus a noun. So instead of I am hungry, we would hear I have hunger in Spanish. So sometimes that can also cause some of these morphology L1 interference. I'm curious if you can think of any more of these that you've heard that might be connected to the first language of this person you're listening to. Beyond phonetics and syntax and morphology, there are a few other issues, especially related to reading and writing systems, that are going to be first language interference for some of your English language learners. Depending on their background, some of your students may be learning a completely new writing system or alphabet. In Asian and Semitic languages like Arabic or Hebrew, you would have a totally different script. Many of those have no upper or lowercase distinction. So the way that we are using writing and script has to be completely relearned for a lot of our English language learners of different scripts that don't use the Roman symbols. In those Semitic languages, reading and writing is right to left instead of left to right. And often even to the unsuspecting teacher or clinician, that can sometimes be mistaken for dyslexia, trying to figure out what is happening with the student who's having a hard time where to even begin on the page. Some L1s, like Arabic, may not include letters that have mirror shapes. So a P and a Q, which kind of mirror each other, or a D and a B, those just wouldn't happen in Arabic because it's confusing to look at. And so sometimes they might misread P and Q or D and B as a result. A really great resource that you might consider adding to your library is Michael Swan's book on Learner English. It looks at specific L1s and their issues with interference with English. And becoming familiar with the issues related to your students' L1s can help you to know why your students are making the errors that they are, and that may help you to give them some targeted correction strategies. I had a student whose L1 was Farsi, and she had a number of problems pronouncing vowels. So I did a little research, and I learned that Farsi has no lax vowels, no a, I. So I was able to design a number of listening and speaking practice activities to help her learn to hear and then ultimately to produce those lax vowels. So understanding specific L1 interference can be very helpful. Well, that is all that I have on this topic, so please have a look at the task list for details on all the activities for Unit 7, and I will see you next time.